In this video, we're going to create your cheat sheet to use in the test. Now I'm on page 87, right? And we're kind of going to just put some ideas all in one place. And this can be kind of a place you can reference if you're like, oh, I just need a quick, like, what was that again? So this is also just a chance for us to kind of review any of the concepts. So we really focused during this unit on the graph, right? We spent a lot of time on our graph with our x-axis and our y-axis, okay, and we said, okay, well, we can plot points where the first number is the x coordinate and the second number is the y coordinate, okay, and we really started talking about the graph on page 51, okay, that was, we started to describe the graph, okay, and then we got into talking about slope-intercept form. Okay, this was a big concept. We spent a lot of time on slope-intercept form. And slope-intercept form is y equals mx plus b, okay, where the m is the slope and the b is the y-intercept. Okay, and we really explored both these ideas of slopes and y-intercepts more deeply, right? In slope-intercept form, we really started to learn about those, about these concepts on page 59 through 60 of your notebook, right? So you can find more details there. Okay, but what are some things we learned about slope? So we said, well, slope, and we really kind of explored slope pretty deeply on page 54 to 55. You can take a look. We said slope, if we're looking on a graph, it's the same as rise over run. We also said we use the letter m to represent the slope all the time. We use the letter m to represent slope. And when, let's say we're given 2 points and we need to find the slope, we can use the slope formula, which is y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1, right? This right here is the slope formula. And we also said, remember that when we're talking about slope and we're looking at real life situations, that slope is our rate of change. How is something changing here? Okay, so we really kind of explored slope in all these different ways. Okay, and we talked about y-intercept too, and all the different ways we can talk about y-intercept. Okay, we talked about y-intercept on page 59. Okay, now y-intercept, we said y-intercept is represented by the letter b, right, here it is. And we said on a graph, right, that y-intercept is always the x coordinate is 0, and then there's always a number here. So the y-intercept on a graph is always like 0, 3 or 0, 2, or it could even be 0, 0. Okay, and when we're talking about real life situations, that y-intercept is our starting point, right? So if a tree is starting at 3 feet tall and then growing a foot per year, our starting point would be 3. And sorry, oops, this should be starting point, not start point. Our y-intercept is our starting point. Okay, so we really discussed a lot about slope-intercept form. And then we also even discussed just more about sort of slopes in general and like the different kind of slopes that slopes could be. So on page 53, we talked about what the different possible kinds of slopes were, right? And we said there was, if a slope was sloped up like this, that would be a positive slope. If it was sloped down like this, that would be a negative slope. If it was just a flat line, that slope would be 0. And if it was this guy, this vertical line, that didn't even have a slope. That was called undefined. Okay. So that was kind of, we discussed all of these concepts sort of within discussing slope-intercept form. We really talked a lot about slope and about y-intercepts. Okay. And then we also discussed standard form. More recently, these past couple weeks. Okay, and standard form was this, where we have a number times x plus a number times y equals a number. And the really big thing that we talked about with standard form was that if we're looking for the x-intercept, which we sometimes are when we're trying to graph, the way that we do that is we recognize, oh, that point is always on the x-axis, which means the y value is 0. So we're always plugging in, if I want to find the x-intercept, I plug in 0 for y. And so therefore, I always end up with a point where I have a number for x, but y is 0, right? And then the opposite is true for the y-intercept. That point is always on the y-axis. And so if I want to find it, right, I know that the x coordinate is going to be 0. So if I want to find the y-intercept, I plug in 0 for x. And so I always end up with a point that's where x is 0, and then y is some number. Okay, so that was like a big concept we talked about with standard form, is finding those intercepts. And then one topic that we covered kind of quickly, and we may, if we find time to come back to it, may come back to more, but we talked about the concept of domain and range. And this was on page 68. Oh, and sorry, so standard form we talked about on page 84 and 85. Okay, domain and range we really talked about on page 68. And here's what we know about domain and range, that the domain is all the x values in a particular situation. Okay, and the range is all the y values. And when we list these values, the really important thing is that we list the values. There was 2 rules. In order. Okay, so in order from least to greatest. Okay, that was rule number 1. With no repeats. That was rule number 2. Okay, with no repeats. So those are our 2 rules. List them in order from least to greatest with no repeats. And we talked about it in 2 different ways, right? One was if I have, let's say, points like this, like x, y, right? So here's an example. Let's say I had a set of points like this. Okay, remember this? The domain would be all the x values. So let's see, that would be 3, 0, and -5. And I need to list them in order from least to greatest with no repeats. So least to greatest, that would start with negative numbers, then 0, then positive numbers. So in this case, right, this was the smallest, next, and the largest. And then the range here would be all the y values. I notice it's 2 and -1 and 2, so no repeat, so I don't list the 2 twice. And I list in order from least to greatest. So the -1 is smaller than the 2. And then the other place we talked about domain and range was in tables. Okay, and in tables, we pretty much always have, like, a table is usually set up like this with the x in the left column and the y in the right column. So let's just, a quick example of that is, let's say I have so here the domain would be all the x values, which in this case is just 1, 2, and 2. I don't list the repeats, so I would just list 1, 2. And the range would be the y values, which is -3, 5, and 1. I'm going to list them in order from least to greatest. -3, and then 1 is smaller than 5, and then 5. Okay, so these were like the 3 huge concepts we talked about, right? The slope-intercept form, the standard form, and then domain and range. And then we kind of explored all these little concepts along with them.